If you don't know who Eric Schmidt is, you're in the wrong room. This morning, as I started thinking about how to begin this, I, of course, went to Google and I Googled economic recovery, and I got 47,500,000 answers in 48/100ths of a second. And I said, well, that's an interesting little statistic, but I'm going to have the man himself here later on, so why don't I just ask him? And I think that's what I'll do. In all seriousness, Eric Schmidt is the leader of arguably one of the most powerful and well-known companies on the planet. We all use his products every single day, multiple times a day. And as such, I think he's probably got something of a unique perspective on this economy, how to steer a company through it, how to steer policy in that economy, and that's what we're going to talk about. We'll go a little bit, Eric and I, and then we are going to open it up for questions. A little bit of housekeeping. There are 2 microphones in the aisles. We're going to alternate back and forth. We need to be out of here, I'm told, by 2:15, so we're going to keep it on time. So line yourselves up when we get there, and we'll just go back and forth. All right? Sound like a plan? Obviously, a lot to talk about in a short period of time, but I want to sort of lay a little bit of a groundwork here and get a sense of where you were mentally back in September when Ben Bernanke and Henry Paulson, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, went up to Capitol Hill and said, this is it. We're done. We need $700 billion. Ready, go.
Well, I was scared. Let me start by saying that congratulations to Walter and to David and the teams that have put this amazing Ideas Festival together. It's really one of the great events in America, and I think you all should be proud to be part of it, those of you that built it. When, in September, the worst day was the Wednesday when the money market funds broke the buck, if you remember that day, and that night, Tuesday night overnight, the financial clearing system of the country almost failed. And the Federal Reserve had to go in and hand money to the clearinghouses to essentially make sure that the money, the dollar, if you will, that was clearing overnight was cleared properly the next day. And I said to myself, how do we get ourselves into this situation? And I still don't know the answer to that question.
Assuming, though, that Google keeps its cash in very safe banks.
In fact, what we did is we took it out of the banks and we put it into sovereign-denominated currencies because we figured that the countries would not go bankrupt.
This country's currency too, yeah?
We did a basket.
All right, good. How are you, assuming all that's true.
It is, trust me, it's true. I'm a CEO, I can't lie. It's like a real
it's
problem.
my job, I have to ask those questions. How are you feeling then about where we are in terms of fixing it?
Well, again, with the caveat that I don't understand how the learned and smart people who were running all of this could have gotten us into this situation in the first place. So with that as a caveat, right? And I think we should have a discussion as to how that happened and how, not just so much from a regulatory perspective, but what was the failure in information that got us to the point where we were in a really good bubble and having a good time and the currency almost failed? Right? Now, that's like a serious error. It's not a small error. With that as a caveat, we're roughly on schedule. If you look at the sequence of events that once the crisis occurred, everyone realized that asset values were too high. You had first a real estate crisis, and then you had a credit and finance bubble. The credit and finance bubble was largely because of unregulated credit instruments, which were shut down with the bankruptcy of Lehman. Everything sort of collapsed, and then we had sort of October, November, December, where everyone's all panicked. The federal government, the Fed comes in with trillions of dollars of guarantees. People forget that there were about $2.5 trillion of additional guarantees of bonds and bond debts, most of which will not need to be delivered on, by the way. The total indebtedness that was guaranteed by the Western world and the United States was on the order of $8 to $9 trillion if you add it all up. These are enormous amounts of money. Remember, the US GDP is 14 trillion. So we sort of created all of that. Then we had the stimulus package, which is designed as a short term, which I was strongly in favor of. And then you have the time that it takes for the system to work. And we're in that period now. Market low roughly in the spring, business cycle low roughly now, jobless high roughly early 2010. We're on schedule. How do I know this? Because the people who got us into this have told us that. Right? So what's a better answer?
Yeah.
What's a better answer? Sorry. if you look at the history, one of the things to learn is when you manage young people is to explain to them that things have occurred in history before. And young people don't often know that or ignore it because they didn't take those classes. And in our case, we're in a classic deep recession, and recessions recover. And I've just outlaid the exact math around a traditional deep recession.
Yeah, but hold on a second, because if you take all of the smarts of Google's computers and pile it into one
we were
big,
not part of that.
No,
September.
you're not. But let's take,
We were
you,
not
you
part,
as a,
in fact, had we been doing it, we might have actually been measuring where all the money was.
well, you guys as a symbol of all the world's knowledge, right, which are out there to collate and make useful. Okay.
Thank you.
If you take that and you combine it with these really smart people and rising asset values, how did so many smart people running the companies and the economy do so many stupid things?
Well, partly because everybody was in their self-interest to believe it. Right? People have studied bubbles for years. I mean, remember high tech? We already had our own bubble. You had your own. You had a bigger bubble. We've already been through. We've been through one bubble, which was 2000, the Y2K phenomenon, and we had a great time. Next time, I'm going to sell at the peak. Right? I mean, I'm just waiting for the next one of these market-induced bubbles. I could have made a lot of money at the time. Right? It's much better to sell at the high in these bubbles. Trust me.
There is, though, no. Yes, we should sell at the high.
Look, this is about ideas. There's an idea for you. Sell at the top.
All right.
Right?
So let's have another idea about how we can get ourselves out of this mess. Do we just sit here and wait for it to happen, or can companies in the economy do something smart?
Well, first place, let's go back to what's really going to happen. I think the U.S. will recover first. The European economy is slower to recover. The conventional wisdom is a 6 months off cycle. That's about right. An interesting insight about the Europeans is that they have their central bank, which is called the European Central Bank, has one mission, which is fighting inflation, and ours has two missions, fighting inflation and promoting growth. And this is called, there's a technical name for this among all the economists. But what's interesting about the European Central Bank is that they have been giving enormously friendly loans to all of these countries to help out, which looks awfully stimulative. So the European Central Bank, within the charter that it has, is doing something similar to what the US is doing. And I think Europe will recover as well. And they're not going to give up their vacations or anything like that in the meantime.
Heaven forbid.
So the fact of the matter is I think that's going to happen. In China, you had the stimulus package. And in China, they had an infrastructure stimulus package, not unlike what we did. The difference is they just did it. They didn't debate it. Some benefits to a command and control economy or whatever you want to call it, China. And it looks like the third world, and in particular the smaller countries, are very severely hurt by what happened because they were in an asset bubble in terms of minerals and so forth, and they also have huge trade imbalances. So we're going to go back to a structure where if you will, the strongest, China, to some degree India, the United States, and Europe, will lead us through this over the next few years.
Why? Why is the United States going to get out first and not China drag us along?
Well, I personally think it has to do with our university systems. Ultimately, the reason these things occur in America has a lot to do with the culture of America. And Americans are optimists. Americans believe in innovation. 90%, 95% of the top universities in the world are in the United States. Many people have tried to replicate these systems. They're very hard to replicate. If you look at venture capital, which I've obviously benefited from, the financial structure combined with new young people trying to create new jobs is phenomenal. We have the fastest growth cycle in terms of new jobs. A typical example is there's a claim that 15% of the jobs every year are eliminated, and another 15%, of course, are created. And that's no solace to you if you are working in an area where the only kinds of jobs, typical example being the traditional American automobile industry, those are the only kinds. The other ones aren't being created. But if you look at the economy as an aggregate, there are other jobs being created. They're just not in your town. And that's difficult. But that's ultimately the genius of the American system.
Can you innovate your way out of a recession, though? I mean, Google's a company that's made its name with innovation. You give your engineers time off to innovate, or on company time.
Well, it turns out recessions end on their own, and politicians love to take credit for their recovery. But one of the simplest rules is that the business cycle has not been eliminated, and there's evidence that the business cycle is going to get worse. And the reason it's going to get worse is things have gotten more interlinked. So we're going to go up together more and down together faster. And by the way, in information markets, the cycles are shorter. It's up, down, up, down, because there's more information. Now, it may be possible to dampen some of these by conversations and regulations. My favorite example here is Iceland. And Iceland, which has 300,000 people and a lot of fish, and had 3/4 at the height of the bubble, 3/4 of its stock market value were the 3 banks that failed.
Bigger than the whole economy.
And they're not known as a banking center. And of course, what was happening was they were arbitraging their currency against the euro. They were essentially lending in one currency and taking money in another. And there was clearly a regulatory failure at some point. I don't fully understand it. But at what point, why didn't somebody raise their hand and say, by the way, it's an error to have 3/4 of your entire market tied up in these banks, given that that's not your economy? And so to me, what I hope will happen as a result of this terrible thing, I'm not trying to minimize it because a lot of people have been hurt by what I consider to be the errors of the global elite and hurt very severely. What I hope is people will say, hey, that doesn't make sense anymore. My house went up 20% a year for 10 years. By the way, that's a sell signal. It doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make any sense. The math doesn't work.
Well, what kinds of companies then? Wait a minute, let me back up and pick up on a thread you keep mentioning, regulatory oversights. Are you confident that the president's regulatory reform plan that he announced a couple of weeks ago is going to go far enough, is going to curb some of these excesses?
I don't think anybody knows. The regulations are long and deep, and there's a lot of anger. And one of the things to know, and our politicians will at least privately explain to you, they are inundated by the anger of the average American as what they perceive as the bailout of the financial elite, the business elite, people like myself, and so forth and so on. And that anger is palpable. So they're going to regulate, they're going to get regulated, and you do not want the government to own your company. You could see this with General Motors and so forth. The automobile industry globally is largely now owned, large chunks of it are owned by governments. It's true in Europe as well as the United States. It's always been true to some degree in China. And so in many cases, they're ultimately going to turn out to be jobs programs. This is a sort of a horrendous structural issue that we face because, frankly, the demand for cars is not as high as our ability to build them.
With the banks getting better, though, some showing profits, some sort of bottoming signal out there, whether we're bumping along the muddy bottom or...
By the way, those banking profits, guess where the money came from?
Yeah. No, raise your hands. There you go. Okay. How do you feel about this proposition that maybe what we've done in not stepping more quickly into the regulatory realm is wasted a crisis? Let the banks fester for a while, given the money, and now they're going to be through to the business as usual.
My personal view would have been to not allow the write-offs that occurred in the banks. It was explained to me that the problem with that is that the banks are actually a different kind of animal than other businesses. If you look at AIG, for example, and again, how quickly we forget. Remember, it was 20 billion, then it was 40 billion, then it was 65 billion, then it was 85 billion, then it was 185 billion. These are large amounts of money. How do you lose that amount of money? If I lost that kind of money, I'd lose my job, right? I don't even have that kind of money in my company to lose.
Which
right?
is saying something, actually.
Thank you. And how do you make that kind of a mistake? And so my argument was that you should allow all of these structures to fail because the collective memory, that is this structure, all those losses will still be around to remind them not to make those mistakes again. The problem with that is it's not, in fact, I was just wrong. It's not how banks really work because they lend against an asset base. And if you can't fix the asset base, which is indeed what the Fed, in my view, correctly did, you don't get credit going again. And if you don't have credit, you don't have your economy. Because we Americans love credit.
If it's not going to be the banks that lead us out of the recovery, I mean, they're stabilizing, but they're not going to lead the way.
It's the consumers in America. It's
okay,
always the consumer.
My question, though, is what kind of company is going to do it? Won't be the financials, not going to be manufacturing, look at Detroit. What kind of company is going to help us get going?
Well, obviously, my own bias would be to do whatever we can to get the next generation of very smart companies in every field going. In the stimulus package, there was a lot of work done to make sure that there was a lot of money to create a green tech sector. And many of us, the people here in the room who are pioneers in this area, believe that the secret to American manufacturing success is our ability to take the knowledge that comes out of universities so quickly and turn those into very highly profitable businesses that move very quickly. The classic example being the Michigan area manufacturing plant that can be converted to build automobile batteries for electric cars. They're example after example after example. And I believe that. The reality is that the problem is so significant that you need to do more than that. You need to look at all the barriers to business. So for example, people who are arguing against free trade don't realize how many American businesses are global in nature, and arguing against free trade hurts American businesses, that kind of thing.
Let me ask you specifically about Google then. Sure. I mean, you guys are everywhere. It is, I think, in your phrase.
That is our goal.
That's right. And you're meaning it. It is, as you've called it, the economics of ubiquity. Yeah. How does that help this country get going again?
Well, we believe that information is power, and because you were asking about the financial things, I wonder, I learned a while ago that the right way to run human systems is transparency, and that almost all of the sort of structural mistakes that we're seeing have been caused by information hiding or by poorly integrated systems. And it's true at every level of politics and government and sort of how systems work. So from our perspective, more information is power. And that the internet is this enormously powerful platform for very, very rapid information flow. Now you see this in the political dynamic, what's going on in Iran, and that story is repeated over and over again. We all understand that intuitively. It's also true in business. It means that businesses can be more efficient. It means that startups can be formed more quickly. One way to say it is that the barrier to entry for a new company has never been as low, because of the ability to get mass distribution, quick access to new information, get your product out, get it distributed, and so forth.
Except for the fact that nobody can get credit, nobody's hiring.
Well, in fact, people are beginning to hire, right, in certain sectors, right? The ones, starting with the ones that are benefiting from the stimulus package. So there's some of that. And as long as you have a reasonable credit rating, the banks will hire you. The issue with credit in the last 6 months is there were an awful lot of non-standard credit. So think about all of these developers that were busy building these huge luxury resorts. They didn't use traditional credit mechanisms. They used complex credit equity swaps and other kinds of things that I didn't fully understand that essentially have all gone away. And their problem is they can't refinance. One of the issues, by the way, is that there's a significant crisis in commercial credit coming, because all of those buildings were refinanced at very high debt ratios. And those things roll over because they don't work with mortgages like we have in our homes. And when they roll over, they won't be able to refinance.
What about the thing you were talking about a moment ago, the consumers? There are consumer credit problems coming, and there is still, I'd be curious to get your take on this, a trepidation on the part of the consumer who still fears for his job.
No, in fact, in March, we had net savings in this country. It was historic.
You bet.
I mean, we should have had a party. And so what's interesting is, of course, we'll quickly go back to net credit because that's how our economic structure is.
But do you believe consumers are ready to really?
I do.
Even in the face of rising unemployment?
Because what will happen is, as we bottom through the recession, which is sort of, we're in the bottoming process now, one of the signs of recovery from recessions is that inventories get worked off, there's new demand for product. Typical example is cars. They did an analysis of the number of cars that you sell per year and the number of cars that get older. And there's an unmet need for new cars because people have not been able to get the financing and so forth for new cars. Well, as financing gets better, as consumer confidence grows, people will buy those cars. And that's very obviously good.
Start getting your questions ready. Go ahead and line up with those microphones. We'll open it up here in just a second. How do you, what kinds of conversations, shall we say, have you had with members of the administration about getting the government back out of the marketplace?
Well, the answer that they give is that we're in and we'll get out.
Oh.
Okay. And when I look at the criticism that, I think it's known, I was a strong supporter of the president and his program. The one really legitimate, in my view, criticism from the other side was that once this spending and once these tentacles get in from the government into the private sector, and in particular the special interests that depend on the temporary spending, it becomes permanent spending. I think that's a very legitimate criticism, and the administration has said that they're going to answer that question by very strong steps in favor of transparency. They're going to show where the money went, what it went for. They're using the web in clever ways, and they're good at this stuff. So I think that as citizens, we should hold them to that commitment, and we should see, after the stimulus bill, more than $800 billion, let's make sure that that part ends and we get back to our normal business, because that's ultimately the secret of America.
Do you think they've met that commitment to transparency yet, or do they still have a ways to go?
They have done their initial filings.
So kinda.
Well, no, but they're on the schedule, but it's
Okay.
a 2-year program.
All right.
So far they've done it. But again, you can imagine they say it, they meant it, they did it the first time, and then they forget about it later, and that would not be okay. So we need to hold them accountable for the commitments that they make as part of taking our money, if you will, and make sure that they really follow through using the tools that are available on the internet. And what's great about it is that although most of us don't have time to study these things in detail, for every program in the government, if you basically publish what they're up to, there are groups that will monitor, they will keep them honest, they will check their commitments and what they say. And that's one of the great things about governance in the internet age.
Again, microphone's right there for those of you who have questions. There was a panel here this morning in this room, Maria Bartiromo and Douglas Holtz-Aiken from the McCain campaign, and Austin Goolsbee from the White House, and David Wessel from the Wall Street Journal. And one of the big themes in their discussion was business investment. In an economy where consumers are afraid, how do you convince businesses that they have to step up and take a leadership role?
Because, well, businesses are run, American businesses are run pretty rationally. And they look at demand and they make their investments based on that. And the fact of the matter is most companies have, many companies have actually fairly strong cash positions.
Most, in fact, right? I mean, even today, most.
And surprisingly so. And some of that is regulatory in nature. Some of it is the way our accounting system works. But the fact of the matter is many, and again, this is unsung, we always focus on the businesses that are credit sensitive. But many businesses, Google being one, have lots and lots of cash, many of the high-tech businesses and so forth. So we're waiting, if you will, for confidence to come back, for the markets to come back, and we know that they will.
You're waiting for us, we're waiting for you.
But that's why these things take 2 years rather than 1 week. That's why there is a business cycle, right? And the funny thing is, I can tell you that we're in a business cycle, and you'll say, no, we're not, because it's like all a disaster. But in fact, a month from now, things will be better. If you look at unemployment, for example, the rate of, in the most recent report, the loss of unemployment has gotten better.
Right. The rate at which the economy is losing jobs, yeah.
Again, the signs are there.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Brian Lehrer from WNYC Radio in New York. Eric, I use Google all day, every day, like a lot of people in this room. But is there ever a point at which Google becomes so big that it's kind of scary and needs to be regulated as a public utility? We kind of reached that with Microsoft in the 90s, some of the same discussion. When you're aggregating all the contents of books, when Google News is the place that people go for news content instead of the sites, New York Times and everything else that you're aggregating, and you know some traditional media are upset with you for that. Seriously, literally, is there a point where you need to be regulated as a public utility? And if you can, please address the news content question in particular.
You'll be surprised that my answer is no. And I would offer as a scenario, would you prefer to have the government running innovative companies, or would you rather have the private sector running it? And there are models, and there are countries where, in fact, the government does try to do that, and I think the American model works better.
But Eric, if I could jump in, I would expect a more sophisticated answer from you, because as we saw with the banks, it's not a question of Soviet-style communism or free market capitalism. The banks needed smart regulation that they didn't have, as I think you were just saying. Is it possible that information is in the same boat?
Well, again, my answer would be no. And perhaps I should expand on my answer. Google plays an important role in information. And the reason you're asking that question is because information is important to all of us. We run Google based on a set of values and principles, and we work very, very hard to make sure people know what they are. So for example, for you as an end user, if you become dissatisfied with you, we'll make it easy for you to switch to a competitor or another choice. In fact, we have a group which is called the Data Liberation Front, which works for us, that actually, which basically works very hard to make sure that there are no ways in which we trap data. So there's a long list of things like that. And companies are defined by the values that they were founded with and that they operate with today. And so if you're concerned about the need for regulation of Google's role, part of my answer would be that The company is not independent of my leadership and the founder's leadership and so forth. The company is formed in a certain way. A thing that you should be worried about is that a combination of special interests plus unintended regulation could in fact prevent the kind of consumer benefits that we push so very hard to do. And part of the reason that part of the other pushback I would offer is that the things that we do are available to others. There's nothing particularly secret in the sense that we've just invented stuff, but we haven't largely prevented people from doing their own thing. It's pretty easy for people to try other things. I'd like to see some other folks trying to lay out an agenda for innovation. With respect to the news question, which I think is what you're really talking about, there's a couple of comments. The internet arrived, and as it arrives, it displaces industries in really profound ways. It changed, and it's not necessarily the player's fault, it's really about how consumers behave. In the case of news content, news readers, that is the customer, if you will, are busy reading news online. And we have not yet figured out the perfect ad model for that. But one of the things that's happening is it's affecting, for example, the newspaper economics, along with the loss of classifieds, cost of print, et cetera. I don't know how to solve the generic newspaper problems, and we've talked a lot about this to them because it's a shared interest. It's from my perspective, a huge tragedy that we would lose investigative reporting in our country, which has driven so much of what we really know and really driven transparency in lots of fundamental ways, both in the US and globally. We're working on a whole bunch of products in that area to try to do it. There is a tension here because the newspapers give us access to their content, and then they complain that we don't pay them out of our other businesses. When we've tried that, there's not enough revenue that we can yet get from their content, and so we would essentially be subsidizing them. That's roughly the answer.
Thank you.
This company's most famous value is don't be evil, right? It became iconic when you guys went public. Does don't be evil also mean always be good?
I didn't major in that philosophical
me neither.
question, so that's a really hard question. A simpler answer might be that don't be evil is a way of operating. It's not unfortunately, if there were a book that said what's evil and what's not evil, then we could just consult it. So what don't be evil says is when you face a question, ask the question, and it's almost like a ripcord within the company. And when I first joined the company, I thought, this is crap, right? These young people having a good time. So I'm sitting in the room, and we're having a conversation about a particular ad product, and one of the engineers, his name is Ron, says, that's evil. And it was like a bomb going off in the room, and I felt like hiding under the chair, because all of a sudden the whole conversation stopped, and there was this lengthy conversation as to whether the decision was based on our principles. And the principles of Google are basically about end users. So I would, to answer the earlier fellow's question even more deeply, we try to make our decisions based on end user benefit. Many industries, whether we like it or not, are not as organized around end user benefit. They're often organized around the supplier benefit or their shareholder benefit. We try to focus on end users.
One more spin off Brian's question, and then we'll get to this side of the room, I promise. A lot of your answer sounded a little bit like what you said in the beginning. How do we know that the economy is getting better? Because the people who got us here told us so. It was a little bit of trust us.
Yeah. Well, what's your alternative? Don't trust us?
Not buy your stock, I guess. I don't know.
But the good news
I
is...
can't not use your products, right?
Sure you
guys are
can.
everywhere.
We have competitors. We have
Yeah,
lots of
but
competitors.
come on. I mean, I'm on the Reader, I'm on Mail, I'm on this,
I'm
on
glad
Docs,
to have you, but every one of those
and I'm sure you are.
every one of them has an able competitor. They really do.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Shelley Porges from Washington, D.C. Google has obviously done phenomenal, has promoted the democratization of information in a great way, and has in fact promoted the development of a lot of innovation and small businesses, or large businesses for that matter. What role can you play going forward to help us get out of this? Or do you envision yourself playing an active role other than what you normally do as part of your day-to-day business, number one?
So democratization of the society or?
No, democratization of the information,
Okay.
information distribution.
Okay.
And access to information. And then related to that, you asked, the question before came up, where is the turnaround going to come from? And one thing that has seemed to be not commented much, other than the broad topic of innovation, is small businesses. Small businesses created
Absolutely.
500,000 more jobs in the last recession than they did in this recession, yet you hear all the talk, going around, the stimulus package, big companies, big sectors, that sort of thing. So how do you see Google playing a role in all of that?
For the second part, it's pretty easy that the internet is such a great friend of small businesses that much of our partnerships, much of our advertising revenue is driven by small businesses because of our self-service advertising. And furthermore, our auction in our business is designed to not favor the big guys, which is a constant annoyance to the big guys. And the little people never complain about this because they know that in traditional accounting structures, they're the ones that are disfavored. So we think we make a good step forward on that. So with respect to democratization of information, it first gets back to whether the information is publicly available. And one of the things that we've learned is that governments are not as interested in transparency as you might think. If you're a government bureaucracy, if you're a government bureaucrat, then Google shows up, and we're sort of a pain in the ass, is the way to describe it. Because all that can happen is you can get embarrassed by access to all this information. It's oversight. And many organizations don't really have that. So we've argued, for example, that all of the hearings that happen in the government in the US and elsewhere should be webcast, raw. And it's easy to do. It's inexpensive. Many companies can do it. And that way, you could literally see what all the public meetings are doing and not have to attend.
So like GovTube instead of YouTube.
Yeah. So there's lots of things like that. And the technology is very inexpensive to do this. It's not a big thing. And I think it would help a lot with oversight.
Yes, over there.
Eric Samperi from Menlo Park. Eric, you've shared with us in the past, one of the other previous panels in this tent this morning was on energy policy in the future. And you've been very open in sharing what Google has been doing the last couple of years in that area. To segue off of the last question, what can Google do and is it doing to help small businesses but also individuals? I know some of the individual stuff is coming to the front now. To conserve energy, that aspect of the next part of the agenda.
So you'd have to be living in a cave to not understand how serious the climate change threat is at this point. And the people who spend their time saying it's not true must not notice the change in seasons, the fact that it gets warmer earlier, the increased variability of weather, the loss of biodiversity, the many, many things that are going on that everyone sees. So we're in a situation, as we know, where climate change is, with a possible exception of a true nuclear war, the greatest threat affecting mankind and our children and grandchildren and so forth. So from our perspective, our contribution is first and foremost to work on our own use of energy. So we have the most efficient data centers and so forth. We use a lot of power. But we've also decided to put our money where our mouth is and begin to invest in the supply chain. So we put together a series of, we sort of studied this for a while. And the most promising things are, for example, with wind technology, with solar thermal, solar photovoltaic, enhanced geothermal, those sorts of things. We've been putting money into those investments to try to build the demand structure because we have good cash and we're obviously a good customer of this and we know we're going to need it. We also authored a plan called the Google Energy 2030 Plan. And the thing that was bothering us was, why doesn't somebody just add all the money up and figure out how much it's going to cost to fix this problem? This is a classic big-scale systems engineering problem. And we were shocked to discover that we made $1 trillion by doing this. And you sit there and you go, like, this guy must be mad. Well, we work at Google, it's sort of a crazy place. But it turns out that if you save the capital to build the excess plants, if you save all of the downstream expenses for these enormous capital expenses, and instead you take the equivalent amount of money and put it into renewables over, in our case, a 22-year period, you actually make money. Another example is that if you move to higher efficiency cars through hybrids and better efficiencies, better car designs, get to the 50, 60, 70 mile per hour car, which is clearly technologically feasible, you save so much money in terms of literally the gas prices, right, which drives everybody crazy, that you really can make a dent in this. So I would offer that in the climate change area, a note of optimism. I don't know whether the Copenhagen protocols and that are going to be successful or not, but I do know that in our own country, we can, as individual actors, take the necessary steps to, by the way, do the most boring thing first, which is to insulate your house and insulate your building. And at Google, we were having a meeting, and I said, well, okay, how much is it going to cost? And they said, oh, $1.5 million. That's a lot of money. And I thought, okay, well, what's the payback? And they said, oh, it's 18 months. And I said, it's an 18-month payback for $1.5 million, and you haven't already done it? They said, no one asked us to do it. Do it! All you have to do is do it. It's so obvious.
Do you ever get sick and tired of what can Google do about the high cost of milk or healthcare or what? I mean, it's, with this ubiquity comes a certain responsibility, no?
In the audience, we have an author of a book on that subject.
Standing right there.
I guess we'll get to Jeff shortly. If Google is a metaphor for thinking differently about problems, then I'm happy to be it. And it clearly helps us from a branding perspective. There are limits to what Google can do. We are a relatively simple company built around information and servers and the web. And many of the problems that people talk about are much more complicated. So as I've looked, for example, at the healthcare bill and so forth, the complexity of that system is well beyond what any company or any architecture could really attack, I think, right now.
Do you think consumers really buy the fact that you guys are a simple company?
Compared to the other companies, I believe it or not, Google's pretty straightforward.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Daniel Cass.
Daniel.
The first questioner asked you a question about Microsoft, and I wanted to follow up on that. Since Microsoft was the company that everyone used to talk about in technology before you came along, in 5 years, what business do you think Microsoft will be in? Or what business would you advise them to be in? And in what ways are you going to compete with them?
Sure.
These are extraordinarily dangerous questions. We have trouble predicting the next 12 months at Google. You're asking me a 5-year question in a different company?
But you're Google.
Well, you've set me up for this one.
Not a plant.
Microsoft's core business comes from 2 products, Windows and Office. They have very, very high market share. They were found to be a monopoly in one of them. They're clearly a monopoly in the other. They're under various legal restraints by virtue of that behavior. So the first and most obvious answer is that they're going to continue focusing on those things. The issue that Microsoft and many other companies are facing is that there's a shift to a different architectural model. And sorry to be so technical here for a minute, but it's called cloud computing. And basically it means that the network is now reliable enough that you keep all your information there. And the idea is that you pick up any kind of computing device and the information is there, even if it's somebody just hands you a device. You just say who you are and off it goes. And this is a very, very big deal in the computer industry, and it's one which companies like Microsoft need to figure out a way to make that transition. Google is organized around making what is called cloud computing a core part of the next generation of architecture.
Yes, sir.
Thanks. My name is Randall Kempner. I run something called the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. It's a group that promotes entrepreneurship as a means to promote sustainable development in emerging markets. So with that background, my question to you is, how do you or how does Google view information technology as a weapon, as a mechanism to support sustainable development? And in particular, is Google doing anything to make sure that it's not doing evil in emerging markets like Africa and Latin America?
We're doing some, and I would argue we're not doing enough. Africa is a very good example because this is a continent of people largely trapped without very much information. A curious statistic is that the internet connections to Africa cost more than they do in the United States, even though the country is infinitely poorer, which has to do with a regulatory failure, a governance failure, and so forth and so on. So we've been working very, very hard to build what are called proxy caches that you can put in the countries, accelerate the local access. We're also doing things, most people who are in very, very poor situations have mobile phones, which is a great accomplishment. Right? The rough number is somewhere between 3 and 3.5 billion mobile phones in use today. By the time, maybe 10 years from now, it looks like 5 to 5.5 billion people will have either a mobile phone or access to one. And they can use those to do things like SMS texting, where they can get a lot of information. So with respect to sustainable development, there's this conflict between rapid evolution of the economics and the sustainable development. We can help market it. My fear is that most of these countries, the fundamental problem is a corruption problem, that the industrial structure and the economic and political structure are not mature enough that when you make the investment that it goes to the right place and achieves the right regulatory outcome.
I'm Jeff Jarvis. I wrote a book called What Would Google Do?
Yes.
And I won't ask you. Since doing that, a notion clarified in my mind that I want to just try out on you is that what we're going through right now is much more than a recession or a financial crisis, that it is a fundamental restructuring of the economy and society, going past the industrial age of mass production, distribution, marketing, media, into something based on knowledge and abundance and the things that I did write that you're about. And when we see what's happening to automotive and banking and newspapers and other parts of media, soon probably advertising, big swaths of retail, real estate, we're seeing a huge and fundamental restructuring that I don't think is going to go back. And that a lot of new companies, one hopes like yours, are going to start creating new versions of these industries. Am I going too far?
I think so. I'd like, of course, that you're good at it, because your book was about taking some ideas and really talking about them in a global context, and very successful, I might add. I think the evidence right now is that while I'd like what you said to be true, it's not today yet true. I'd like us to make it true. And the reason is that almost all of the money and almost all the people and almost all the capital is not going to where you described it. It's going into traditional businesses and traditional industrial and service operations. I think one of the ideas about the Aspen Ideas Festival is to talk about new ideas like the one you proposed, is how could you accelerate that transition? What happens is that you get a young entrepreneur like in the kind of industries that are difficult to transform. And when you talk to them, they've hit so many regulatory barriers, so many barriers to entry, so many other ways that we need to find ways to make it easier. So when as a young engineer, I was very interested in trying to make the internet more successful, and I ran into the regulatory structure of the telcos. So for example, there was something called a T1 line, and what happened is everyone figured out how to build a business beneath the regulatory pricing for a 1.5 megabit T1 line. So an artifact of regulation was that a whole business was created. Had the regulation not been there, we would have been 5 years farther along. And I think if you look at every one of these businesses, you'll discover that the incumbents, typically large companies, working with regulators, have ended up making a cozy structure for themselves. And when the truly discontinuous idea comes along, it's not in anyone's interest to take it on. And that's why the market pressure is so fundamental. So going back to our earlier conversation about the government and its role, governments are not particularly good at dealing with change. Right? One executive told me that high tech works 3 times faster than traditional business, and government works 3 times slower than traditional business. Right, so that may be in his extreme case. We designed our government not to change very quickly, and yet we are asking for very rapid change. It has to occur from the private sector, it has to occur from enlightened leadership, and it has to occur in areas where money is being made.
So could Google only be Google because you were doing something new?
I would argue that Google is as successful as it is primarily because of the openness of the internet. That had you had brilliant founders such as Larry and Sergey in a difficult regulated industry, the progress would have been much, much slower. And people always give us so much credit, but let's give credit to the people who foresaw the internet, opened it up, designed it in a way that it did not have significant choke points, made it be possible for random people, including 24-year-olds in a dorm, right, to sort of enter and create something new. That's a story of innovation that's very, very precious, and we need to make sure that we preserve it for the next competitor, by the way, of Google.
Let me just zero in for a second on that question. Do you not then believe that this economy has been, through the past 2 years and the changes we've seen, fundamentally reset, that we're just going to proceed from here apace?
Well, I would like it to be true. My question to you is, where's the data? When I look at most of where the money went in the economy, when I look at the tradition, all the politics and all the bills and so forth, and I've supported much of this, most of it's going to the incumbents. Now, with a counterexample that we doubled our National Science Foundation funding from $3 billion to $6 billion, which is a drop in the bucket. There's more money for appropriate medical research and those kinds of things. But fundamentally, if you look at it mathematically, the majority of the power and control is still not around real innovation, and that needs to change.
Is Google still a new company?
Oh, sure. Well, hopefully.
Really? You guys have been around forever, it seems. I mean, right? I mean, our collective experience is, oh yeah, it's Google.
Well, one of the things to say about brands is that brands can be created very quickly. Had anyone heard about Twitter 2 years ago? And yet Twitter is a phenomenally successful company and brand. Who here knew about Facebook 3 or 4 years ago? Phenomenally successful. So one of the things that's neat about being in our world is that new companies and new brands can come along. In Google's case, we believe the way we run the company, which is rather unusual, keeps it sort of young. In particular, our engineers are encouraged to spend 20% of their time working on whatever they want to work on. And before you get too excited, these are engineers, right? So they don't sort of move too far from a field. But virtually everything we've done that has been creative has really, really come from that. And top-down centralized control from people like me is not going to drive the creativity.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I've read about Google's, say, tracking pandemics, or epidemics, I'm sorry, by using search information. And
Sure.
I'm wondering how else you plan on using the search information in the future, and if it will be regulated, if you think you'll be able to, keep control of that kind of information.
A very good question. So everybody knows we put together a flu trends program, and we used anonymized data. That is, we took the searches, but we took away the information about the person. And we discovered that because when you get a symptom like a disease, the first thing you do is you type the symptom into Google. We could see months before the official reporting agencies could see the emergence of a new horrific disease. And the estimates are that this will save tens of thousands of lives. That's a huge, huge thing, right, from our perspective. And we're very excited to participate in that. We don't want to take that too far. And the reason is that there is a very fine line between anonymizing information to make people healthier and then the sort of spookiness and privacy issues that we're so concerned about. In the European Commission, there are a series of laws called the European Data Privacy Initiative, which regulate this to about an 18-month period. And so it looks like historical logs, literally the things that you've done 5 years ago, will be deleted both by policy and also by law. There's a very legitimate tension between the state interest in, for example, police action, and then your interest in privacy. And each country sorts that out differently, and we're subject to all of those laws. My own guess is that we'll end up with about an 18-month kind of period for search logs, and we'll be very careful about using much of that beyond things like flu trends.
Again, though, it comes down to trust us with this data.
Well, in this case, it's also trust the government. And depending on your point of view of the Patriot Act, that's a good or a bad thing, right? So again, this tension, we made a decision that we don't know how to make the decision about that trade-off. That the political process, that the governments that debate this fundamental tension between civil liberty, state interests, safety, and so forth is not one that we should have an opinion about. And that was a difficult transaction. But how could we decide whether it's 18 months or 12 months and so forth?
Just a couple more, I think. Yes, over there.
Yeah. Hi, David Cunyon from New York. Can you elaborate? It's a follow-up to Jeff's question about the old economy, new economy debate. Can you expand on so many of what you've done has been so successful, but Frugal was a project that really wasn't that successful and has
Why
to
do
do.
you have to remind me?
Well, can you elaborate a little bit on your view of what didn't happen there in terms of being able to use the power of information on the internet to find low pricing and to be able, in this economy where you've got so many stores and traditional retailers shutting down, what it is about, so many of the models and so much of this conversation has been about advertising models or monetization using information, whereas real retail about pricing and the ability to really move the economy into more of a different distribution model. Can you talk a little bit about pricing and distribution?
Remind us what Frugal was, and then explain why it didn't
So
work.
Frugal was our first attempt at product search. And it didn't work because it just didn't work. And we celebrate our failures inside the company because we want people to take risk. So we replaced Frugal by what is now Google Product Search, which has been doing pretty well. And Frugal was a destination site. It had the wrong user interface, didn't have all the right products, did not have enough inventory, that kind of thing. A long list of things that we did wrong. So one way of sort of stating your question a little differently is to say that how will the commerce world change now? I think that's roughly what you're asking.
Yeah, instead
You
of
have things like-
advertising models, commerce.
Yeah, you have product search and so forth. And we're exploring that now. Let me give you an example of a product that we've just released. It's a product for your mobile phone. And you take a picture, with your mobile phone of a UPC barcode, and it tells you whether the product is cheaper online. Okay. Well, you can imagine, right? Well, you can imagine who's in favor of this product. Okay. You can also imagine who's opposed to this product. But that's an example. And one of the discussions for you all to think about is, what are things that are neat that we could do with the collective intelligence of what people do? People are smart. And within reason and respecting their privacy, could we in fact get better bargains, better delivery, those sorts of things? And that's just an example of it. I don't know. We have, again, Google Product Search, which is doing very well. We have more and more people using product purchasing. You could imagine things like subscription businesses and so forth. And eventually, if you look at the success of Amazon, I think proves that this model works well.
But are you surprised at how fast or how slow things are moving online in terms of the growth of online commerce?
I'm pretty happy with it. I think that most people now know that when you buy things for Christmas, by far the best way to do it is to do online and then just ship it to the person. And there was a point at which e-commerce became reliable enough that you wouldn't be embarrassed at the Christmas party. And so I think e-commerce is not only here to stay, but now people are arguing over the tax exemption that it has for sales tax and those sorts of things. So you have arrived when that's happening.
How hard are you guys working at getting away from ad revenue as...
By the way, we love ad revenue.
Absolutely.
We love it. Do you know what percentage of our revenue it is?
Over 90.
97.
There you
or is
go.
it 98?
Does
So
that
we
number,
love ad revenue.
Doesn't that number scare you, though?
No, we love ad revenue. The serious answer is we are diversified across advertising. We would like our board members call it more legs of the stool, please.
Yeah.
And we have a pretty successful business in the enterprise, which we think is going to be pretty exciting. And we've got a number of other sort of subscription non-advertising businesses underway.
Yes, sir.
Hi. This one is probably a softball, so it's more of an invitation for your perspective on, I think, what is a reasonably hot topic, and particularly in your industry. So talk about immigration policy, outsourcing of jobs, H-1Bs, sort of the balance of human capital trade, how many people are we sending overseas and doing the same thing, yet at the same time trying to shut down the, this reciprocal. Just be curious about your thoughts.
Well, again, I don't know if this is a softball, but it's like, okay, let's go through this.
Well,
We take
I
the
think I know which
smartest-
direction you are on
Let's
this
take
one.
the smartest people in the world. Let's bring them to the United States. Let's educate them and give them the top universities, and then let's kick them out of the country. Now that makes a lot of sense. Furthermore, they can go to the other country, create, using all of our American ideas, take all of our intellectual property, and create businesses to compete with the American firms and pay taxes to those governments. How am I doing so far?
It's a very big swing, so it's suggesting.
Do I have your
softball.
vote yet?
Yeah.
I've been trying to figure out what is the intellectual basis for opposing my argument.
Well,
And there must
you're
be-
engaged with the administration. You are
There- but there-
ubiquitous. So
there must be-
what is that? I mean,
I've
what
given
do
this
people
speech.
thought?
I've just been blunter than I just was. And it seems to me that there is an intellectually correct view, which is that everyone is exactly the same and that there's no difference in intelligence and ability between every human being. And if you believe that, then don't live in the same educational system that I do. I just don't understand. We have this amazing asset in America. The smartest people in the world want to come to the United States, and then we kick them out.
Do you get any traction with this discussion in Washington?
I just get louder.
So how do you really feel? Howard, I think this is the last one right over here.
Okay. You haven't talked at all about cyber terrorism or cyber crime or just manipulation of data which is untraceable and what dangers we really have as consumers.
And it's worth pointing out that people were talking about you as the first chief technology officer of the United States.
Right.
So
Better to work for a private company.
you keep saying that.
We like private companies. Innovation is where it occurs. The internet is full. It's shocking, but the internet is there's actually criminals on the internet. And when I used to talk about this 10 years ago, people would say, "Oh, how do you know that?" I said, "Because they're human beings on the internet, right? And not everyone is perfect, right?" And so the internet has had just generation and generation of the kinds of attacks that you're talking about. Typical example is people will find 5,000 computers that are idle because they'll exploit some bug, often in one of our competitors' products, and they will exploit that bug And they will do a systematic attack on a website called a distributed denial of service attack. And the significant players that are in the industry are all well insulated for that. So we face this all the time at Google. So the kind of attacks that you worry about are the ones that are not like that. So you could imagine a state-sponsored attack where they used, for example, the name servers to spoof you and say, this isn't Google, this is somebody else, which would require sort of an incorrect behavior by a government. And we worry about that. We worry about the financial system, and in particular the money transfer systems, and the kind of checks and balances for moving money around, and that's been a problem. I'm not as worried overall because the problems that we face not just from cyber terrorism, if you will, from states and horrific people like terrorists, but we face them from 16-year-old idiots as well. And so we're sort of used to it. So I'm not as worried about it as others. I think we should, it's a price of being interconnected, that you're also interconnected with the people who are going to do nasty things. And we need to make sure that our systems are designed to prevent it. The internet grew out of this notion of communal sharing, and all of us who've been part of it have had a rude awakening when we discovered that the internet could be misused. And again, I think we've addressed it largely.
And with that, I think we're done for the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your crowd, and thank you, Eric.